So let's try this again. Take two. Welcome everybody to TCoffeeAndCode for October 22nd. This is Jim McKeith. Joining me today we have Ian Barker.
Hello everybody.
And from TMS Software we have Dr. Holger Flick. And the amazing Bruno Ferenz.
Hello everyone.
And actually,
he's more laid back than the rest of us.
It's always interesting for me thinking about when I've met people who I've met and stuff. So I've met Bruno and Holger. Ian, have we ever actually met in person?
No, we haven't. Although we probably talk more than anybody on the planet about everything, but no, we physically never met, despite living in the same country. So there you go. So far, it will happen though.
Yeah, it will happen. Yes. Well, with COVID now, it makes everything weird, but probably will happen. Yeah. It's interesting with Kerry Jensen. He lives in Texas as well, but I met him for the first time in Germany at Econ.
Yeah.
I met him in the Netherlands, just as strange, at one of the conferences in the Netherlands. So also not in the States.
Yeah, it's kind of odd, isn't it?
It is, but hey, that's life. That's fine.
Well, I can tell you the stream's working fine, so
yes,
that's a good start.
Does appear to be. So a lot of times when we're talking about Delphi, we're talking about, I guess, disclaimer, blah blah blah, our opinions, whoever, whatever, you know the drill. But usually we talk about Delphi, we're talking about native apps. And native is kind of an interesting term because it means different things in different places to different people and such. But today we're talking about running apps in the browser. And when they're running in the browser, native in the browser means what? What does that mean to be native in the browser? It means, it used to mean JavaScript, but now it can mean WebAssembly and such. So that's why we're talking with Bruno here, as they've developed at TMS Software their TMS Webcore, which is a solution that lets you write your code in Delphi in Object Pascal that you know and love, and it runs natively in the browser. So can you give us the quick rundown of TMS Webcore? What does it do? How does it become natively in the browser from something that you design in the IDE?
Well, I think the best comparison is that when you generate a Windows executable from your Delphi IDE, basically it creates the executable and you run the executable from the Windows operating system. I think that the browser can be considered these days an operating system. And so what we do is compile the Object Pascal code, or better transpile it. And that is actually done through a branch from the Free Pascal organization, the Pas2JS transpiler. That's what we use. And this way we generate a JavaScript file. It's a file, and I consider this, or it's a kind of equivalent of a Windows executable, but it just happens to run in the browser. And the browser, of course, exposes lots of APIs to achieve whatever you want to do. Manipulate the DOM or set the window title, etc., etc. There are tons of APIs that the browser exposes. And so your application runs in the browser through, in this case, JavaScript language. And it takes advantage of what is available in the browser, just like your Windows executable from Delphi takes advantage of the Windows API that is available. The difference, of course, is I think the nice thing, of course, is that the browsers are standardized. That means that if you generate that application once, you can run it on every modern browser. Be it on a smartphone. We can even run these applications on the WebKit browser running on a Raspberry Pi, for example. It runs on the browser in your Tesla car. It runs in the browser on your smart TV. So I think pretty much everywhere where there is a modern browser, your application can be used.
Just for the record, the license does not include the Tesla car.
Oh. Is that a separate license I need to get for that? Because I'm planning to get a Tesla Cybertruck.
I keep telling my daughter that her education is my Tesla. Her college course is roughly the cost of a Tesla each year, I think. Maybe not that much, but it feels like it when I'm paying the bills. So.
Sorry for interrupting, Jim. Sorry.
So I was going to say, it is interesting. Usually, so I know that I've always had the mindset of a browser app operating in the browser, working with the DOM, working with the browser window and such, but discovered that actually there's quite a bit that is exposed about the operating system. For example, you can access the camera in the browser, you can access USB ports in the browser and stuff like that. So there's a lot of rules about what you can and can't do in the browser. You're not going to run in full admin mode. Well, it probably is a way to make it work, but it'd be a hacky way. But you're not going to get the full platform admin mode like you could in a Windows application. But you can still do most everything you would do in a native desktop application. But you have the advantage of working cross platforms. What are some of? Were you going to say?
Yeah, what I was wanting to say is that over, I think, the last decade, we have seen increasing efforts of the browser manufacturers, and it's actually from what I perceive from here, it's mainly Google who is the driving force behind that. They have increasingly added support for directly accessing things like you say, the camera, but even Bluetooth these days. There is also a mode to access local files, for example, of course, with restrictions. But the main idea remains that, of course, people expect that whatever they run in the browser, which is actually just a URL away, that this will, of course, keep their system completely secure. That whatever URL you might hit, that will not do anything unwanted to your device or machine. And that, of course, requires a certain set of rules and implies restrictions. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing to emphasize as well for me was that we're doing a project at work that is TMS Webcore, and they also, unfortunately, they have another software house that's working on something which is Angular. And we had a very serious discussion about 2 weeks ago where I literally said to the product owner, look, if you want to go down a different technology stack route, we can do that. Here's the pros and cons for doing that, because obviously, with Angular, and there's a lot of publicity surrounding, the Angular language, and lots of people say, oh, why are you using Delphi? But actually, after a long investigation, the company decided to stick with Delphi and specifically TMS Webcore, because we could, first of all, leverage all the code that we've already got, because we've got a lot of human resources and time and attendance and very complicated stuff that's got a lot of business logic in, a lot of regulations and laws. We could leverage all of that in a web app, and so focus really on making that web app do exactly what it needed to do in a browser, because we needed a browser interface. We didn't want to have a thick client native app for this particular solution, but we could take all of our Delphi code for the previous apps and reuse the parts without having to write some of this very, very complicated code again. And that was really the overriding factor that came up. It was the speed of development and the fact that we could reuse code that we've had, legacy code that we've had around for a long time, but actually target newer platforms like web browsers, like progressive web apps, like Electron, dare I say it, but I told them not to use Electron, but you know, you know, but it meant that, you know, we could do that, and we did have a very, you know, I felt I was obligated to say to the company, look, if you want to, we can move away from the Delphi stack. Now, luckily, partly because, you know, I'm an MVP, but luckily they did see the reason not to do that, and it was to stick with Delphi. So, and Webcore, you know, and this sounds a bit like an advert. I say this every time I talk to Bruno and Holger, but luckily Webcore is a very, very well-rounded product, and with FNC components in and the new stuff that I'm sure you can talk about later on as well. You know, for a Delphi programmer, stop messing about. If you want to get into the web apps, use this stuff. Use Delphi and use Webcore, and you can launch yourself into a browser-based product with all your code in the background. Why throw everything away? If you've been working on Delphi programs for 20 years and you want to reuse that code, yes, it's not all going to just work straight away. There are new paradigms to do with asynchronous coding and the web browser. Although it's got lots of capabilities, there are some restrictions and stuff like that. But generally speaking, I can reuse code that we know it's been through lots of tests, lots of usage by customers, has been tried and tested. Off we go, there is the product. And that, to us, was the killer factor in saying we're going to stick for this new project with the Webcore stuff. Now, the other team that are using Angular and TypeScript, they've been on it for 3 weeks so far, and they've only got as far as some wireframes. And I was saying this before we started. Actually, the other team was a guy who's virtually working part-time. We had something like 12 to 14 actual live screens working within 3 weeks. Not wireframes, real screens. And so, you know, I know people watching are going to go, well, Ian's a Delphi guy. Of course he's going to say that. Anybody doesn't believe me, come to me and I'll honestly show you the difference. This is not a fake thing. It's not me talking up the products than Delphi, even though it is. But it's the truth. It's the truth that we're more productive than this other organization that are helping us and doing a good job, by the way, but they're slower because they're using technology that takes longer to ramp up, you know, and get this. And what's Delphi? Rapid application development. That's why it's RAD Studio. Come on, you know.
That's exactly the point that I wanted to make. Like TMS Webcore gives you different levels of web development. You can start off with an approach that you've been taking for years. You start off with a form on your screen. You can drop components on the form, press F9, and you get a working web application. Does it look already like other web applications, perfectly styled? Not yet, but there's transition to using other web-specific styles, using CSS or using templates and binding that wireframe that you create in the form designer to existing templates. So it makes the transition to the web really, really easy. And the number one reason is you can use concepts that you have been using for years. You can use data modules, you can use forms, all the classes, the business logic you've written, you can use. And TMS even has the T data set implemented, meaning you have a T web data source and you can hook up to your specific things on your web page using common concepts that you've known for years. Of course, you can't connect directly to your database using FireDAX, so there is a HTTP component that can serve to deliver the content for your T dataset. So you can reuse the concepts that you have been using for years and get started significantly quicker without learning completely from scratch something new. And looking at other web frameworks, I can tell you it is going to be completely different. You know, like just the way forms are being built. And with web development, there is one hurdle. That's the HTML and CSS design, because we're developers, we're not designers. And there's two routes you can take. You can either take some significant time and learn these concepts, or, and TMS Webcore makes this easy, you can do the web design in cooperation with a professional web developer. So you concentrate on your application, and the HTML CSS might even already exist in your company, and you can simply merge it without your application being delayed by the design or the design being delayed by your application, so you can work completely separate from each other. I think that those are the major points, that your application development for the web is unaffected by, well, we want to have it for the web.
We have an advert which some of the people watching may be aware of. Look, we're looking for Delphi developers, and by the time some people will see this, we probably have hired them. You know, I didn't advertise for web developers. I advertised for Delphi developers, and said, this is what we're going to be using. We're going to be using TMS Webcore. We're going to be using Xdata in the background, and MySQL. And I said to them, look, you know, I can teach you what you need to know about Webcore if you don't use it. You do need access to it. The particular project that we were advertising for was just a month, but we've actually got many other projects that last longer than that. But we just want someone to do a month's worth of work on a particular Webcore thing. But I don't have to ask for web developers. I have to ask for Delphi people. And that's the great thing, that because of the way that the you know, Webcore even allows you to have HTML that's completely separate, almost like a template. In fact, that's what it is. And have a web designer that goes off and says, okay, I'll do the CSS and I'll do the layout of the screens if necessary in HTML, and then we can have the TMS Webcore Delphi code actually manipulate those objects. Now, that's not actually not how we're going to do this particular project, but it is the possibility going forward. So our next project, there will be a lot more of that. We'll have a designer designing the HTML and CSS, and then someone write the back end code. But the respondents that I got to that advert was good. You know, we had a lot of people respond, and some of them were a little bit shady, and a couple of people were sort of unhelpful. I don't understand why anybody, when I put a job advert up, would try and troll me, but there you go. You know, they do those things. But all we had to do was advertise for Delphi people. The people that responded, probably a third of them have used Webcore before or want to use it, and nearly all of them had access to or use TMS components. So, you know, as an employer, which is effectively what we are in that kind of context, it was very easy to find the development resources that will work on a completely new project for us, and that's a web-based product, but without them having to be web designers, and it's a massive strength, you know, for us, I think.
What are some of the so when you're switching to, when you're doing kind of, how to say this, if you're coming from somebody that's a desktop developer, you mentioned the idea of working with asynchronous calls and stuff like that. What are some of the other shifts you have to make as far as your development mindset goes when moving from desktop development to web development?
I think, and I'm referring here to the number one question, absolute top number of questions is about database access. So that's really a paradigm shift developers have to make, how you access a database from a web application. That's obviously not the same as you would use FireDeck and directly access a local database or a database in a local network. And that's for obvious reasons, because when your application is running in the browser, it would be a huge security breach if you were able from that browser to manipulate or to do whatever with local databases. Imagine that you would hit some URL, that URL runs in a web application, and that web application could make a connection to one of your local databases and start to remove tables, for example. That would be a total security disaster. So database access, that's the number one thing you need to rethink when you create a web application. And the typical approach here, the most standardized approach, is that you expose access to your database through a REST API. And there are different ways to create REST APIs for performing operations on your database. Embarcadero RED server is such a solution. Even with DataSnap, you can build such an REST API for your database access. We, from TMS, we have Xdata. Mormot is a solution. The Mars REST library is a solution. And I'm forgetting for sure several others. But the thing is, there's a backend, and that backend is typically a REST server offering some API. And the thing is, as long as this is based on the REST standard, you can couple any front end consuming these REST APIs with any kind of backend. So just like Embarcadero RED server, for example, can be used in the backend for an XGS web application or an Angular web application or a Webcore web application. In just the same way, Webcore can use backends, Embarcadero RED server, Xdata. I know some customers who use PHP to perform calls to the server too. And I think ASP.NET Core is another example of technology that you can use to create such an backend and REST API for accessing whatever on the server. And so it's a paradigm shift, and it's important to realize that you can mix technologies here. You can maybe reuse already some existing backends. That's possible. But of course, we Delphi developers, I think in our world, we are lucky enough, I think, that we perfectly have the tools to build the backend and have the tools to build the front end. So I think for the Delphi developer, ideal scenario, you build your REST API backend as a Delphi application. Typically, that will be a Windows server executable or a Linux server executable, and your front end, which you can also build from the Delphi IDE.
When I was in Australia for an event a few years back, I'm trying to remember when that was. I was talking to one of the developers there, and she said that she had picked up the TMS UNC components because even though she was currently doing VCL, is it UNC? No, FNC, yeah, components. Because she was currently doing VCL, but she knew that she would eventually need to do other platforms, FireMonkey and such. And so she thought by having the FNC components and getting really good with those, that would give her the ability that in the future, if she wanted to move to FireMonkey, or I'm trying to remember, I think this might have been before the TMS Webcore was introduced, but now with TMS Webcore, you can of course move to the web with FNC as well. What are the I guess, so I thought that was kind of an interesting idea, and I think that the way FNC is set up and that you can do that, where you have the same set of components that you use across frameworks is great. But what are the, I guess my question was going to be, what is the downside? You mentioned databases access as being a paradigm shift. What are some of the downsides? What are types of applications you wouldn't want to make a browser first or browser only type application?
That's a good question. Anything that I just want to use local, that is very CPU intensive, for example, very database access intensive, that for security reasons only run on specific premises. things like that. Multimedia might also come to my mind. Video processing, compressing, all these kinds of data-intensive algorithms. Yes, these are the first things that come to my mind, thinking about where native local running applications would be a preference. I think it's quite clear that the obvious advantage of a web application is that you can just access it from everywhere, that you do not have to install this application, that as a user you do not have to bother about updating this application. So all the updating happens server side. So when you hit the URL, you're always on the latest version. So this is for me the number one reason for wanting a web application. If I happen to visit my mother, for example, and I have an urgent need to do something with some application, whatever, I can even use her iPad and navigate to that URL and do that something. With anything local installed, that becomes problematic. And yeah, that's what I think. What I also think is that progressive web applications are coming a great way to actually hide the difference between a local installed native application and a web application, without losing the disadvantage of a web application being that it is always up to date, always the latest version, without you having to do anything. And so a progressive web application is something that where you have the opportunity to add it to your desktop. You start it from your desktop, be it on a smartphone or a desktop machine. And when properly programmed, you can even achieve offline functionality this way. So you're not forced to be connected to the internet when you go in that direction of progressive web applications.
Yeah, I mean, our solution that we're working on at the moment does have, majority of it is not online, is not progressive web app. It does need to be online, but there is one section that is a progressive web app, and it's written in Webcore, or being written in Webcore, actually, as we say, and that is a time clock, and the people can clock in and out on their phone, and it uses the device to grab the geographic location. And these people are visiting places where they do not necessarily have any form of internet access at all, Wi-Fi, you know, 5G, 4G, or any G, and some of these are truck drivers as well, and they clock in and out on when they make a delivery. What it does is takes GPS location, or the nearest Wi-Fi location if it's available, and by triangulating, it then caches the transactions, the clock-ins and clock-outs of the person, and also some of them are tasks. So, you know, they're like delivery number 1, 2, 3, and it records the fact they did that at that particular time, and it took them this length of time and clocked out. When they come back to a known location, that is a trusted location, so it's not a public Wi-Fi or free McDonald's Wi-Fi or some kind of, you know, place where you're kind of a little bit suspicious about the security of it. It can then connect to the server securely, which, you know, is as secure as it can be for a web app, and will then upload the cached information. The rest of the app does actually need an online connection, because, you know, it's got some stuff in there like personnel information that has to be, you have to know where it's being displayed, and you have to know who's seeing it. For GDPR, for Europe, and for United States, there's lots of different states have different rules about you know, personnel information. But other than that, the other time where you might not use a web app is where you absolutely have to guarantee the integrity of the code that's being run. Most of it, if it's running on the server, so initiating some process that happens on the server, like the data retrieval and data access, you can use securely. There's encryption and tokenization and stuff like that. But of course, the browser at that point is effectively the operating system. And if you go into the development tools, you can see the JavaScript. And if you're that kind of person, you can go into the JavaScript. And if you're clever enough, you can subvert the mechanism of the JavaScript. Because even in Webcore and IntraWeb and a few other technologies, you are basically transpiled down to JavaScript. And at that point, someone can do things like alter some of the resources and things like that. So for high security applications or high integrity applications where you need to know for certain that this browser program that's running is actually not in any way fiddled with, then a native app is the only way to go, because it's almost impossible to go to a native app and in some way hack it nowadays with code signing and operating system protection like iOS and Android has. You know, the package is usually double checked by the operating system to make sure that it has not been altered from when the original developer created it. With a web app, you can't do that. I think that will come. I think because web apps are going to become more popular. Already they're hugely popular, but I think that's still an area that needs addressing by people like Microsoft or whoever to make it so that you have a package that is your web app, and that package has got an integrity that cannot be subverted by someone pressing F12 and going into the developer tools and hacking around with that. And I think that's the thing that's currently missing from the browser ecosystem. Edge, Chrome, none of them have got that capability. Even if you compile down to WebAssembly, which is going to be coming, I'm sure, but even if you compile down to WebAssembly, they can still go into the tokens of the WebAssembly and alter that. There is no way of saying this block of WebAssembly code is unchanged from when the developer created it. And again, I think that may be part of the solution to the problem, is that that's what you do. You have a WebAssembly module, and it has got some kind of checksum that can't be recreated, a code signing checksum that stops people interfering with it. But that's in my opinion, that for me, that is the only downside to a web app. But other than that, it's all advantages. You know, things Bruno said, like updates are instantaneous for anybody using the app. Bang, they get the update. You can A and B test, which you can't easily do with applications. So I can, with the right kind of routing on the app, I can say, okay, these guys will use version 1 of the app, and these guys will use version 1.1 of the app, and I can get some people to, you know, I can put some metrics in, because now we have a direct connection to that app running in the browser, because that's how it works, and I can see, oh, they never use the document handling page of the personnel section. Why would we spend time developing that? You can put those metrics in a native app, but it's actually much harder to do. With a web app, it's very, very easy. It's, you know, browsers have always, you know, web servers have always had that kind of logging capability, and obviously Google and Facebook and all the others want to track every click you do. But with a web app and Delphi obviously coming into that, you now get that massive advantage that is beyond some of the other advantages. You're being able to do A and B testing and different routing and turning people's access off like that. Oh, you haven't paid us on our subscription model? Bang, it stopped immediately. Not wait for the operating system to come back, because, you know, we're business first. We're business people. You know, that's our viewpoint of that. We want your money. We're not making any apologies to that, but in return for that, we'll make you the best app we can and give you the best product. But fair exchange is no robbery. You pay us, and in return, we'll do the best we can for that money that you're paying us, but you must pay us. And of course, in business, some people don't pay. Well, you want to stop them using your app straight away, right? Or at least cause them some pain to make them pay up.
So there's a comment. There's a comment here by Colin. It says real-time apps should not run in the browser. I think one of the big things that I encourage is that this, oftentimes we try and say, what is the one best answer? What is the right way to do something? And the reality is, I think most of the time it depends. And I think with application architectures, right, there's lots of reasons. Like occasionally, like, people say, should I use FireMonkey or VCL? Which is better? Well, it depends. And I know some people will definitely say one or the other, but the reality is that you need, as a developer, you need to have some awareness and some familiarity with a breadth of tools and solutions and architectures to solve different problems in the best way. I think that once you go to a type of architecture where you have that decoupling of layers, right, where you can have a backend that you can connect to from multiple types of clients. So whether it be using Xdata or DataSnap or RAD server or even PHP, then you can have a desktop application, Windows desktop application built with VCL. You can have a web application built with Webcore. You can have a mobile application built with FireMonkey or whatever, all sharing that same core. But at the same time, so I mean that kind of makes sense. There's a good architecture choice, but there's also times when certain types of applications or certain parts of an application do make more sense for different types of platforms or solutions. So yeah, it's never going to be, I don't think, going to be everything should be this. Like blockchain's really big right now. Everything doesn't need to be blockchain. There are some things blockchain's useful for, some things there's not. I remember when the NoSQL databases like MongoDB were really big, and I was at a conference. It was first coming out, and a conference, the guy was talking about MongoDB, and there was a guy was there. He's like, "Well, we're using SQL Server right now, and MongoDB I hear is really fast. So should we switch to MongoDB from SQL Server to make our database application faster?" And it's like, MongoDB has some speed benefits, but it's not the same paradigm. And so, yeah, it's certainly, it would be nice if our industry was really simple.
It's like saying, should I ride a bicycle or should I drive a car? They're both big. And the difference is that the bicycle has many advantages if you live in the right country where you're set up for that. In the Netherlands and actually in Germany as well in some ways. A bicycle is a great form of transport. It's very healthy for you. You know, God knows I'm a programmer and I could do with all the health I could get, you know, rather than the calories. But it's not very fast. And also in some countries, like in Dallas, for example, you will die very quickly if you go on some roads on a bicycle. Unfortunately, they do have cycle networks, but it's not very popular. So should you use this form of technology for your database, or should you use that form of technology? You use what's appropriate to the circumstances of your app. And MongoDB is perfectly fine, but MySQL also rules the roost, and so do, you know, Oracle, you know, if you've got massively deep pockets, or SQL Server if you really want to burn away money until you've got none left. You know, it's great, but you know, but for me, I think that these things where people say, oh, but what about this technology? Well, everybody used to write all their web pages using Adobe Flash, you know, and nobody does that anymore. And it was a great technology, and at the time it did some very unique things that of course meant that everybody adopted it. And Flash web pages initially were very good because they were interactive and they provided capabilities that nobody else could do. But of course, it was very vulnerable to all sorts of viruses and attacks, and eventually got superseded by all sorts of technology. Microsoft Silverlight came along, and that was going to be the Adobe Flash killer, and that didn't work out, did it? So, you know, HTML5, excuse me, and CSS3 and JavaScript, you know, or ECMAScript as it is now, is definitely much more capable than back in those days. But you know, it's not all about TMS. We've got two TMS guys here. There are other technologies, because people keep saying, oh, when is Delphi going to do web stuff? It's always done web stuff. You just really haven't looked in the help, have you, very well? But there's lots of examples there of how to do it. For me, I prefer TMS Webcore because it solves some really good problems for us as a developer in terms of easily producing some screens that look like I expect them to. Has all the good things about Delphi, which is what I see, is what I get when I design the screens. And slightly to, you know, TMS's annoyance, I would say that IntraWeb has that benefit as well. Not as good, but it does provide that capability. Where the two divide out is that IntraWeb is very much its own beast and does things its own way, whereas Webcore, I'm just writing, largely writing Delphi code, which then gets transpiled. So there are differences in approach, and they're both have their own. You know, we have an IntraWeb app that's very, very popular, but we now use Webcore to you know, solve a lot of those problems. And of course, you know, IntraWeb is doing their best to bring out new releases, but TMS just keep pushing on new products and new components and new features. So what are you going to do? You know, you're going to wait for another year for an IntraWeb update. And I'm sorry to the IntraWeb guys, because I do know them well, and you know, I've been on streams with them, but TMS are annoyingly good at coming out with new things all the time, and I like them, so I'm going to use them. And I'm just in terms of that, I'm just a consumer of the products. And if you're going to do a web app, of course you can use Delphi, and you've got multiple choices. The UniGUI, which has a completely different solution for making applications become web enabled, and IntraWeb, which has its own way of doing things, and it's great for the solutions it comes out with, but they're still trying to play catch up with the modern world, and they've got their own issues going on. And then there's TMS's Webcore, and for me, TMS Webcore is a no-brainer. It absolutely does exactly what you would expect it to do, and you keep bringing out new components and making it very difficult for me to go, no, I don't like it, because I do like it and it works. There you go.
I think we need to emphasize because
now, guys. By the way, I'm kidding.
We need to emphasize one thing, I think, because that is something that I see Delphi developers struggle with at first when they see TMS Webcore for the first time. So what happens if you press F9? So we already said it like formally, well, your Pascal code gets translated somehow. So that means your Pascal code becomes a web page with JavaScript that you can copy onto any web server, meaning it doesn't matter which domain provider you use, which operating system or web server that provider uses, you can use it with anything. It works with Linux, it works with Windows servers, you can, whatever you want to use. If you want to use IIS, Apache, Nginx, it works with all of them. And that is the big difference to other products, because other products produce Windows binaries, and you launch these Windows executable files, and those provide the web server. That's not the case with TMS Webcore. You end up with a web page that you can deploy anywhere you want, and you have no dependency to any other executable binary. It really becomes you can literally say it becomes text that you can deploy onto any system. It's compatible with everything.
And actually, that's a very important point, because not only does it provide pure HTML and JavaScript and a little JavaScript application that you just put on your web server and off it goes. You don't need anything special installed on the web server. You don't need to install a DLL. You don't need to install anything at all. Just a web page. You could run it in Linux or what you name it, it will work. But not only that, and I think it's something we probably haven't mentioned so far, is that if you hit F12 and you pull up your developer tools in Chromium or Edge, if you've compiled it in debug mode and you've got your .map file there, you will see your Delphi source code. So if you set a breakpoint on your Delphi source code, or set a breakpoint in your developer console in Edge, blow me down if the app doesn't just stop, and there's the line of Delphi code that you've worked on. It's seeing that happen for me was the light bulb moment where I went, oh my word, they're really onto something here, because this is for a Delphi guy, because I prefer Delphi over everything else. I can write in C#, I can write in TypeScript, I can write in JavaScript. I was a COBOL programmer. I'm, multilingual in terms of Delphi, software development. But I like to see Delphi code because I get that the most. And when I hit F12 and there's my breakpoint, and oh, that's why that particular thing wasn't working, because I, was calling some wrong object or some bizarre thing. And the output debug string, if you're using that method of logging stuff, where does it go? It goes out in your browser console. Come on, how easy does this have to be? It's the poor man's way of debugging code by using output debug string. But you see my beard is grey, right? So I've done this for a while, and I don't like learning new things if I can help it. So and I just keep saying every time we're on here, it does sound a bit like a sales forum for TMS, but if they stop making good stuff, I'll stop saying good things about them. So it's just the way it works, really. Simple as that.
Another thing that is also asked quite a lot is integration into other web systems. For example, if you go to flexengineering.com and to the books page, you see that there's like a tiny little application where you can select the book, the language, and then you can click order. That is a TMS Webcore application. So you can integrate these pages into pages of content management systems like WordPress, Joomla. You just need to integrate another page. That works fine because it's nothing special. There's no binary. It is HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and of course, any of the resources that you use. If you include specialized images, logos, of course, these are part of your application, but TMS Webcore takes care of that and deploys them to the server as well. So that is really the key point, that you are free to use whatever you want to use. And if you use technologies, we've had this on TCoffeeAndCode, if you use technologies like Docker, you can deploy your web application with the web server to your customer in a tiny little Docker container, and there is no deployment whatsoever. The only thing you need to communicate is what port your application runs on, and then you can connect from any web browser. And the web browser, that's also something we have. Exactly.
Code as well, because it's basically just JavaScript and HTML. So if you've got a solution that can run HTML and JavaScript, it probably can run the apps as well, and yet you're writing Delphi, and that's the important thing. You're writing Delphi code, and out comes a HTML, just a normal HTML program, and with the components that you get in, I always say to people, get the all access plan because it solves all your problems. Then you got everything you need. But if they choose not to, they can, pick and choose which bits they want. They might not ever want the X data stuff. Fine, okay. I think you're doing everything the hard way if you don't, but good luck. But if they've got the FNC components and they've got the Webcore components, that's 90% everything. Now with the new WX stuff, is it WX? Yeah, okay, WX stuff that they've got, that's all the other bits as well. So, and Miletus, I personally don't use Miletus. I think it's an interesting direction to go in, but I haven't used it yet. But if you are a Delphi programmer and you're on the fence about writing a web app, or you get a lot, I know you must get pressure from people saying, oh, we must produce a web interface for our apps. Well, you can do that, and there's no excuse. Come on, it's not that difficult. I did not have to learn anything. I knew how to do HTML stuff, but I didn't have to learn any JavaScript trickery. I didn't have to get my hands dirty with horrible, JavaScript constructs and things like that and do anything. No, you know what I mean? And go on courses on, YouTube learning how to do stuff with templates in Angular or other horrible things. So all I had to do was just write Delphi stuff, and it works. And I am good at Delphi, otherwise I wouldn't be an MVP. I talk a lot, but mainly what. I cannot emphasize enough, it's just so easy. And a lot of us older Delphi guys are getting a few people, drinking the Kool-Aid, shall we say, of people like Microsoft and others who are saying, hey, you should really be adopting TypeScript and Node.js and the other libraries, and I don't think that's absolutely necessary, particularly if you have a large legacy of code that you know works. So,
Exactly. And the key is, if anybody ever looks at TypeScript, you can do a lot with the language, but to get to the point where you have a web application with several pages and your data in classes and all that kind of stuff, it takes time to set that up because all the examples are pretty basic. And with TMS Webcore, you start at a whole different level to build applications. And as I always say, to build an application with Hello World or whatever, it is literally file new application, drop the components on the form, press F9, and there's your web application.
Sorry, the office manager is doing weird things on the floor, so I'm stroking him to shut him up.
A small tidbit, which was something which surprised myself, and it's already some time ago. That was actually a customer using TMS Webcore, and he got in touch with us at some point, and he mentioned that he had achieved to actually put his Webcore application on an Arduino Wi-Fi head. So he had a little Wi-Fi head for an Arduino that was running some small web server, and he had put the Webcore produced files, the application, on that Wi-Fi head. And so he was accessing Arduino stuff through this web application running on the Wi-Fi head. That's just a small tidbit that I wanted to share, because these are the moments that I enjoy the most, when users come back to me and surprise me with super creative things and things that I didn't think about myself.
Yeah, that's one of the things about software development and development tools, is that they are, to a degree, like, for example, if you give somebody Microsoft Paint, for example, they can do a lot with that, but there's a pretty finite limit in what someone can do with that, right? I mean, they can produce any pixel combination on a palette, on a canvas. But with software development tools, the permutations and possibilities are endless. And I remember years ago, I was teaching a middle school, like 12 to 14-year-old students, intro to programming, and we were using Scratch, which is a simple 2D, kind of like Turtle, if you're familiar with Turtle, that you have a sprite and you can give it rules, but you don't write code. You use these little things that you connect together visually, so there's no syntax errors or whatnot. And
programming with Lego blocks, that's what it is.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
Lego.
And I remember, working with them and introducing different things, and coming by one of the students, and I'm looking at him like, "Did you make this in Scratch?" And I'm like, "Really?" And it would just blow me away. And Scratch is so limited in its scope compared to, TMS Webcore or Delphi, or, once you start getting out into more of these things. So really, it's amazing to see I'm the same way with you, Bruno. I love seeing creative things people do, and like, I knew that you could theoretically do that, but to see someone doing that is pretty exciting. And honestly, that's one of the things I love about Delphi and TMS Webcore as well, is that the Delphi gives you this like really easy, I love doing the demos where I write very little code, and boom, I did look, I've accessed the camera and took a picture, and Webcore gives you some of that same thing. So you have the components, and I could drop the components down and connect them up and do things. But then one thing I like about Webcore, and I haven't used it very much, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like I remember seeing that you can, with Webcore, if you want to, you can get into the JavaScript and HTML that's generated through this and expand it and extend it. And someone commented about like XJS bindings. You can do XJS bindings with Webcore, I believe, if it's not already built in. So it gives you this like high productivity jumping off point so you can like get that 80% mark done. But then when you're like, you know what, I really need to get down here and do something really crazy and creative on my own, you can still do that all in the same stack. You don't have to go, get another set of, hire another set of developers to understand how to do some other language, other framework. It's all in the same stack. Is that accurate? You can do that with Webcore?
What you say, that is the integration in the web application itself is at the level of the JavaScript code. And so if you add other libraries that are purely written in JavaScript, you can access that from a Webcore application. And it's because in the browser operating system, so to speak, the common language is JavaScript. And so from a Webcore application, you talk to any other JavaScript library that might exist. And to be honest, I have been surprised myself at the immense amount of interesting JavaScript libraries that are just around and just ready to be used. I give one example, OCR, text recognition. I was looking into that territory. Well, there exists a wonderful implementation to do OCR. It's a JavaScript library. And so it can be easily consumed from a Webcore application. That's no problem. We just went a step further and we wrapped a WX component around it so that you get access to that OCR JavaScript library from a VCL application, a FireMonkey application, also a Webcore application, of course. So wherever you want to use that particular functionality that's available up there for free, you can do it. And that's the wonderful thing, that the JavaScript language is here the key to integrating all these things that the world, it's immense. There's a vast amount of functionality already there to be used.
The way that it does it actually is using the ASM block. Is that right? You put in right. ASM. Yeah. So in some ways, it's a really good kind of parallel to writing a program on Windows, where you might want a particular piece of code to run using some assembly language. If you're completely crazy and want to write assembly language and get old before your time, but you can put in ASM and then you have a block of assembly language code. And there are plenty of developers, who like some MVPs that do that all the time to get the most performance they possibly can out of that code. Now, on the Webcore side of things, you put that ASM in and you can just literally type some JavaScript in and execute the JavaScript. And I think people don't realize that it's almost like the script tag in a HTML page. There's all your Delphi code, and then you can almost have the equivalent of the script thing and put your JavaScript in.
But the cool thing is that inside of this ASM, you can use local variables and also field variables that you have defined in your class. So even if there is no component, for example, that's what I looked into for a customer recently, if there is no component for Chart.js, which is a huge charting library, there is the possibility that you have an array of your values in your TMS Web Core, and then you simply hook this array of values to the data source input thingy of Chart.js and write assembler around it, ASM, and then your control is shown on the web page with the data from your TMS web application. So it can be integrated, and if you use a Bootstrap layout, that even integrates into your Bootstrap layout, because that's all in your HTML and not in your application logic.
And I should say, in our application, which is pretty extensive, in fact, we've got 3 applications that use Webcore, but the big one, we never really found it necessary to do anything like that, apart from one particular area where, and this is kind of a plug for another Idea company, so I'll give a little disclaimer there. API Layer are also owned by Idea as well. And they, if you don't know who they are, go to API Layer and look them up. They're a very interesting bunch of people, but they have lots and lots of different APIs, hence the name API Layer. and I've done a little bit of work with them in the past, and they have some very interesting APIs for things like getting background information on an IP address, for example. So if you are looking to, how should we put it, do some proactive blocking of people based on their IP, or even just find out where their real location is, some other information, API layer has probably one of the best APIs for doing that out there, okay? And of course, not...
Or FNC Maps, which includes API layer.
Does it really? I didn't know that. God, see, that's so
it's interesting.
I was going to say that was an example where we did use the JavaScript side of it, but most of the time we never even needed to, and in fact we didn't want to. We want to just do it at the Delphi level and then let the components do the rest of it. Hog is getting a book, you see. We've started him off now. He's going to pull down 18 books and go, I've written all these, and there's no examples in there. Why didn't you notice them?
Yeah, you can. You can get like, and I even have an example here. See, you have like all the different other.
It's on my shelf behind me. I should know this.
See, it tells you exactly where you are with position, IP address, with results, even the address where you are. And
this one uses the paid extra bits where you get some more information about the IP. Like there's a trustworthiness of the IP address, so you can say whether or not that IP has actually been previously marked as a hacker, for example. Yeah. So it gives a trust level, but you pay for that. That's
yeah. So
you and I had this conversation, I seem to remember as well, didn't we?
Yeah, the book describes IP stack, which is part of API layer. And since last week, Bruno can fill the gap. Last week they have another source that gives even more information, including what Ian just said, the trust level. But that was last week. I missed it.
Yeah, but anyway, my point really was that actually, apart from that one exception, that was we never really needed to do anything weirdly JavaScripty most of the time, and we just write Delphi programs. And the guy who works on this particular program was his English level was not very good. He was based in another country. Great Delphi guy, and never used Webcore before. And so we went to him, and I gave him a spec and some screen layouts, and said, here I am. I'm going to teach you a bit about Webcore. Go off and learn it yourself and come back to us. He was writing code within 2 days that was production ready, and that was impressive, really. And he could have done the same thing. I have to say, you know, just to be fair, you could have done the same with IntraWeb, but it's a different idea. You know, the Webcore is specifically aimed at writing Delphi programs that become HTML web pages and an app, whereas the IntraWeb is more about writing like a IIS module or a standalone executable. So there's similar ideas, but they diverge quite wildly between the two. And with the latest version of IntraWeb, they've added some functionality, but they're still lagging behind a little bit for various reasons. And Webcore is, you know, at the cutting edge, I think, currently. Chris Peter says, now we need the JS to PAS transpiler to reverse it all back from JavaScript back into Pascal again. I think we're going to have to block Chris from now on, really.
There are ways to do that. But one thing that's interesting about API layer, actually haven't had some meetings with them over there, and the API layer, it's interesting. They've said they talk to their customers, and most of them forget they're using API layer. It's like, hey, we need a way to do whatever, and they go, oh, here, they find API layer has the IP address lookup thing or whatever, right? That you can, or you know, whatever it is they're doing. There's a whole stack of APIs that they offer, and they grab one and they use it and they put it in their solution and they forget it's there, and then either the annual bill comes up or in the future they're like, they get an email from them and they're like, do we use this? Oh, we do use. Oh, that works great. We forgot that was there. It was just doing its job, and they forgot about it. So, yeah, it's API layer. I'm actually working. One of the things, I have all these little projects I'm working on. One of the projects I'm working on is to try and get more opportunities to talk to Delphi developers about how to use API layer. Maybe we should do a TCoffeeAndCode on that. But anyway,
there's a few things like that actually.
Yeah.
There's one more interesting thing I wanted to address, because there have been a couple of questions about asynchronous behavior and all that stuff. And for Delphi developers, it's still rather new, and we got like anonymous methods, so we can write completion handlers and all that stuff. So that's great. But TMS Webcore has one specialty, I should say. They have the my pronunciation is pretty bad as a German-speaking English, await. So that's the keyword that has been introduced. Await, yeah, the W is difficult after the A. So, and so that's a new keyword. So you can get rid of all the asynchronicity and can write code line by line, and the statement waits until you return the response. For example, from a web request, the thing is your code is still running in the background, so it's not blocking your application. So if you connect
Delphi developers, and the most equal parallel to that is the idea of when you form, you get a form and you say show modal, because what that is a blocking call that waits. So it's like saying await and this code. So it's like do this code show modal almost. You know, that's kind of what the await keyword does. So and then the next set of code doesn't continue onwards. It's put on a little stack and waits until whatever you've just called await comes back again. It's a good word, await, but it does make it difficult for Germans.
Yeah, but you can have many of these running at the same time, because each of them is asynchronous. And so the one thing that was difficult at first for me, connecting to a web service in order to get data, you had to connect first. Then when the connection was established, you could have follow-up requests. So you can now simply say connect and get data and assign the return data directly. So it's 3 lines of code. And back in the day, you either had to use events like onConnect, then in onConnect, you say get the data, then that component had an onReceive. But now you have 3 lines, and it's really, really simple. So that's a huge improvement.
Yeah. And it's actually a keyword that I wouldn't mind seeing crop up in Delphi.
Because other languages have it too.
Yeah.
Moz has his I can't remember what his library is called, the asynchronous threading library for Delphi.
Oh, okay.
Omnithread library. So he has the Omnithread library, and it has some great patterns in there for doing that sort of thing. But then he has his book on high performance Delphi programming, and then Dahlia also has her book on asynchronous programming in Delphi. That both, I mean, they don't introduce the await keyword, but they introduce some really good patterns that you can use to accomplish, productively with. Accomplish that sort of thing and help you to understand how that works and stuff. And it's really important. It's interesting. I was talking to an MVP, and they were doing something, and I mentioned something, and then I said, "Oh, have you read Dahlia's book?" And they're like, "Oh, I was going to. I haven't read it yet." And then later on, they're like, "Oh, wow, I read this book. I should have read this a while ago because I discovered a few things I was doing wrong." So
David Cornelius' book coming out as well, which is also very good as well.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that one too. That one's on the maintaining and upgrading legacy projects.
Yeah, that's right. I've been given a reviewed copy. I'd already bought a copy, but a packet came to me and said, "Hey, do you want a reviewed copy?" I'm like, I just bought it, but hey, I'm supporting David, so that's a good thing. But of course, there's some guy called Holger Flick who's got all sorts of books out there, and I know I've heard they're not very good myself, but just kidding, they're great. But I've got a whole stack of them behind me, and I think that's the thing that actually just recently there's been a bit of a renaissance in publishing Delphi books, and Holger probably led the charge. Really, he wrote quite a few before other people went, "Hey, wait a minute, there's a market for books. I'll write some." But it's
what else to do in quarantine?
DelphiBooks.org has got a whole load of them on there, and some of them are a bit out of date, but many of them still apply, because that's one of the great things about Delphi, right? Is it's backward compatibility with the language. You can take Delphi 7 code and almost without any changes, compile it in Delphi 11 and it'll work. And most of your Delphi 11 code, if you don't do some of the new features, you can take that and compile it in Delphi 10.33 or something like that. The language has evolved massively over time. I keep telling people this, that you do need to upgrade your compilers every now and again because you're doing everything the hard way. Because string helpers, class helpers, managed records, and stuff like that are a big step forward. And it's one of the reasons why, if you're using Delphi, 2009 or Delphi 7, I understand there's probably a cost with components and things like that, but really, once you start to use some of the new language features, just like finding a set of files, for example, iterating through a folder, looking for a set of files, the amount of times I see solutions on Stack Overflow or something like that, it's like 20 lines of code with this callback function in, and I go, you can do that in one line of code. You literally can do it in one line of code with modern Delphi.
E-directory.
Yeah, it's like, come on, it's just user interface. When you get this thing saying not responding and you're trying to move your Delphi app around, there's tasks and stuff like that will solve all those problems. Application.process messages is not multitasking, everybody. It's just allowing your non-multitasking app to catch up with the big queue of messages. And I've never tried to claim to be a tricky or clever programmer. I'm a regular programmer, normal person like everybody else. But what I try and do is get the language to do all the clever bits and all the components and libraries like Webcore to fill in the gaps. I'm lazy. I want the language to do everything for me and to write as minimal amount of code as possible.
I talk to a lot of Delphi developers that say something similar, in that they don't see themselves as being a programmer or a super sophisticated developer or whatever, but that they see that they're trying to accomplish a goal, right? They're trying to provide a solution. They're trying to solve a problem. And the best way to get there is with Delphi, and with the stack. And honestly, books and components are kind of falling in the same boat. There's a lot out there, and yeah, it is kind of expensive. But if at any point you're trading dollars for hours, right? Whether it be you're hiring a developer, you have employees that you're paying by the hour to do something, or you are providing a service where I have to provide these features and I get paid this much money. If you do the math, unless you're way undercharging for your time, and even if you're being paid just on the project level and not by the hour as well, it really pays off to be using the latest version of the developer tools and buying a few components, and you're saving a lot of money. And really, the best code, the easiest code to maintain is the code you didn't have to write.
You know the difference between a junior developer and a senior developer? Senior developer knows how to use Google. That's the difference. Copy and paste, there are lots of jokey t-shirts saying copy and pasting from Stack Overflow, but that really, the older you get, the more you think, you know what, somebody else has probably solved this a different way. And even if it's not in Delphi, if it's in some other language like JavaScript, you can usually easily interpret what they've done and code it. But it really is as simple as, I can Google better than you, that's why I'm quicker at answering some questions. And
so I guess
Alistair Christie is an absolute minefield for such great tips, and I don't know how he does it. I know he lives on what he calls what does he call it, a lifestyle blog, which is a bit like a home farm, I suppose. That's my understanding of it. I must ask him sometime. I'm going to be interviewed soon, by the way, for the blog.
Did a tour of it for Delphi's 25th birthday, I think. He went out and did a video walking around it.
I must have missed that. I've probably seen some stuff, but he's a really great guy. But his most amazing superpower is how many times he's come up with a tip where you think, that really does, save time. It's incredible. And he spends a lot of time going through the language and learning all the little tips and tricks and the new components and features. And LearnDelphi.tv go there and you will learn Delphi, and the nice little bite-sized videos and things like that.
So I totally agree. You should be using search. You should be searching using whatever search engine you want to use. Doesn't have to be Google. But I will add the caveat to it to look at and understand what it is doing, because they're unfortunately, and I'm part of the problem, because a lot of times I'll make like sample code to show somebody how to do something, and I maybe don't cover all the bases with it. It's like, this is the basics of how to do something, and if you take this like, oh, that's the best way to do it. No, it's not the best way to do it. I showed you the basics of how to do it, and you need to understand what's going on before you implement that in production, because you may have other things. There was a whole big article a while back that showed a number of Stack Overflow answers that were the accepted answer that had security issues for cryptography or whatever, and people were cutting and pasting them, and they were showing where it was showing up in production code exactly like it was in Stack Overflow. Now, in those cases, they're pointing out a lot of them were technically wrong to begin with, just because. But the reality is it's impossible to cover all the bases in providing a summarized answer. Otherwise, it would be too complicated to try and follow.
Technology evolves as well. You know, if you're looking at an answer from 2009, you're looking at a solution that's 12 years old. I know it doesn't seem like it, does it? But it is 12 years old. And the reason I remember that is because I actually came to the US in 2009. So that's a year to pick. But you're looking at 12-year-old code. What has happened in 12 years? Find a picture of an iPhone from 12 years ago, and then think, wow, I am pretty old. So, you know, Delphi is constantly moving target in terms of the capabilities that are in it, and the same with the libraries that are available, like the TMS libraries and things like that. The stuff that came out from TMS in 2009 is not the same as you're getting now, and the stuff that you can do with Delphi 11 is not the same as necessarily the capabilities you could do in 2009 version of Delphi. So, you know, it's not just that the answers are necessarily wrong. It's just that the answers it might be possible to improve on those answers nowadays with new libraries, new solutions, different changes to the operating system. I can't tell you how many times, you know, Windows comes and drops some kind of bombshell on us where something that used to work absolutely fine suddenly doesn't. I remember when browsers suddenly made it mandatory to support HTTPS. And so all those little bits of libraries that you weren't calling by HTTPS suddenly broke in the browsers. And that's the thing, that the answer that you gave in 2009 might have been all right, or even if it was a little bit dodgy, it was okay. But now, in 2021, as we are at the moment, aren't we? Yes, good. You know, things have moved around and things have moved on. So, and HTML5 wasn't around, you know, 5 or 6 years ago. It is now. CSS3, you know, a few years ago, it was not around. So
I was looking at some code to do emulate. So I got an Apple M1 computer. Or Mac Mini with M1 processor. I was looking at some code to let you emulate x86.
Ian is
different
laughing.
x86
I know why.
systems. What's that?
Ian is laughing, and I know why, because I just returned mine.
Holger
really?
and I chat regularly, and he's been sending me messages of woe about his Apple hardware. So,
well,
yeah.
they just announced the new M1 Pro and M1 Max. I think they are. Anyway, the interesting thing was looking at this QEMU, I think it is, and there was a thing showing, look at how great it does the job of emulating or letting your own Windows XP as Windows XP x86 on an ARM M1 computer. And I'm like, yeah, but Windows XP is 20 years old. And I did not realize it was that old. I remember when XP was like new and exciting. But wow, that makes me feel old. But you know, your comment though about things changing. I remember when the 4G Apple or iPhone came out, and there was a big issue where there's all these programs on the iPhone that had kind of dodgy connectivity things, and were using like connecting too often or trying to download too much. But it wasn't a big deal because 3G was so slow you couldn't use that much data. But then as soon as all these phones became 4G and had 4G access, then people were like blowing through the data caps and taking servers offline because these apps were just hammering them too much. And it was, so it is interesting. Things change a lot. I was just at physical therapy this last week and was talking to the therapist, and he was saying he was at a continuing education session over the weekend learning about different things. And all careers, all industries, all occupations, all trades have evolving things change, and best practices evolve and new things are discovered, new things are learned, what we're working with changes. But I think technology, where we're at in software development, probably changes the fastest.
Yeah, there's a few people who have mentioned, just slightly off the topic of what we're talking about, a particular little issue with Delphi 11 to do with list boxes. And people saying, oh, will this come out in the next release and will these things fix? First of all, as an MVP, whilst I do know some things and some things I can't talk about, there's nothing particularly special. I don't have some special magic connection to the rest of the world and press some button and something happily happens. And even Jim doesn't really get that opportunity often. However, if you know an MVP or you're friendly with an MVP and there is something that you consider a massive blocker, and I mean it's got to be something that is, obviously an issue or is critical to you, if you talk to the MVP or contact them without hassling them, because most of them have got day jobs, we do have ways of raising these things with the appropriate people. I can't guarantee that anybody would fix anything. I can't guarantee what would go in any patches. I can't promise you that anybody would even care that I might send a message to people, but we will do our best. That's what an MVP is there for. We are there to try and help out. We are effectively champions of the product because we believe in the product. And if there is something like this particular list box thing that you think is a bad problem, I know you're not the only one, because I work on the blog from time to time, and then there have been some comments to do with that as well on the blog, blogs.embarcadero.com. We will raise it, and we do occasionally get asked, are there specific issues, shall we say, that are people are bringing up to your attention? And we do go and let people know. Again, there's a big machinery that goes on behind the scenes in terms of releases, in terms of patches, in terms of testing. You can't just, it's a complicated process. You can't say whether something will or will not make it. There's timescales involved. But if you tell us, I give you my word, we do let people know about these things within the capabilities, what we can do, because we do have a day job as well. We also need to earn a living, doing non-MVP things. But I promise you, don't keep telling me. I will make sure someone knows about RSB-35654. Okay. Because it's a few people have mentioned it, and I know based on the comments I've seen that people are taking it seriously. So that's
put it in Quality Portal is the #1 thing to do, and then follow up on Quality Portal if there's questions asked about it, and then you can let someone know about it. But I know that they do review everything that's in Quality Portal. It doesn't mean it's going to get fixed, but they do review it, and things don't always get fixed as fast as I would like, or even I've talked to Marco and David as well, and there have been things that are like they want to see as well, but it just, there is a huge breadth of things that we would like to do and have worked on. But anyway.
I think this is actually the biggest trouble with people, that I don't mean that in a negative sense. What I mean is that the difficulty here is, and I know most people are very appreciative of large engineering projects, but some people aren't. Some people think that, hey, it's a bug, they can go into the program and fix the bug. But what you're looking at with Delphi is, first of all, it's Rad Studio, it's Delphi, it's C++ Builder. There are multiple builds going on behind the scenes. There are multiple people involved. There's lots of commits going on. That's one thing. Secondly, there are many languages: Japanese, English, German, French, Spanish. to take into consideration. Many developers don't work on projects that are anywhere near the complexity of that kind of number of moving parts and cogs and gears. At the end of the day, you look at that and go, well, wait, it's a slowdown in a list box. It should be something someone should spot, and it should be something that should be fixed. Hands up, yes, okay. It does seem like one of those areas where someone probably should have not let that happen. But getting it fixed is not a case of just changing a few lines of code or taking someone's suggestion of here's a patch and it would fix the problem, and combining it in. And as someone who works on large group projects with many moving parts, you know, I can fix something in a particular part of one of our applications, and we're nowhere near the size of Embarcadero, and that build can take 50 minutes just if I change the full stop or the capital letter on a piece of text, because there are many different images going out to many different variations of those images. Those then have to go up in a staging server, they have to go through a testing process, they have to go through multiple antivirus scanning, code signature, provisioning out to activation servers where our code activates, you know, your license and checks your serial number. You cannot just go, oh, I'll copy a file around on a floppy disk back in the days, and I can't put it on a CD, and I can't even copy it from one share to another. I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying that that is the reality of when you ask for something to be fixed. Of course, it should be done if it's a big problem, but getting it done is actually hard, I think, from what I see, and sometimes it's hard in non-obvious ways because there are teams of approvers and all sorts of nonsense goes on in the background.
It's mostly, a lot of it comes down to priorities as well too, unfortunately. Although it reminds me, sometimes I see these bugs and it reminds me of the joke. And again, I hate to make light of this because I realize, but like we go to the doctor and you're like, doctor, it hurts when I do this, and the doctor says, yeah, don't do that anymore. By doing this, it causes an error. Well, don't do that then. No.
So,
that being said,
whilst we're talking about GIS and web applications, just to bring us back on focus a little bit, this is TCoffeeAndCode, and we do say it's a light chat. Bruno, there's probably a question for Bruno and maybe Holger, but probably Bruno. The Miletus technology is very interesting because it seems like, and I've not used this, so I don't. This is why I'm asking these questions. So I don't know more than a passing kind of knowledge of it. But my understanding is it allows you to create an application that will be cross-platform. Is that right? I mean, do you want to just give us the kind of, you know, heads up on what Miletus is and how it works? And I assume I'm pronouncing it correctly. I think I am, but.
Well, basically what Miletus is the following. Think about an application we just talked about, and that's actually the subject of today's TCoffeeAndCode. Web applications running on the browser operating system through the language JavaScript in this case, maybe, who knows, in the near future also via WebAssembly. The key thing is that the browser is the operating system, and that you create via Delphi an application that runs in this browser operating system. Now, if you have this application, and Jim said it in the very beginning of this TCoffeeAndCode, that of course there are restrictions when you run in this browser operating system, restrictions that are not there when you run natively on the Windows, Mac, or Linux operating system. So the idea of Miletus is actually to create a native application with a bridge between the native operating system where it runs on and the actual application that runs in the browser. And that means that from the browser, you can use that bridge to achieve specific functionality that was otherwise not directly available in that browser operating system. And via this way, it enables you to access things like local files, for example, use things like the native Windows or Mac or Linux open and save dialogues, the toast messages, taskbar notifications, but also database access. So a local database like MySQL, for example, can via this bridge be made accessible from your web application. And that actually means that you write your application once, it gets packaged into this Miletus shell applications, and this Miletus shell application achieves functionality directly available on the operating system where it runs that was otherwise not possible when it was just running in the browser. And so you write your code once, and you can run this type of applications on Mac, Linux, and Windows. And the user interface, you create your user interface using HTML5 and CSS3, which can, in some scenarios, some cases, can be an advantage if, for example, you use off-the-shelf, readily available, some free, some like $20 templates, where someone else with graphical talent already created some nice, consistent GUI using HTML and CSS. And so you can adopt this technology to create GUI that was, well, could maybe be achieved with VCL or FireMonkey, but here you can, let's say, grab it for free somewhere or for $20, and you have already something nice and something that looks great, and that will be identical on the three different operating systems where it runs on. Actually, we do not have to hide away things or put things in a corner. Electron is actually the same ID. I think the big difference between Electron and Miletus is that Electron deploys along with your application also the whole browser thing, which makes it a huge deployment. I lost count of how many files you need to deploy for an Electron application. That's one thing. Another thing is, so here what we do is we use the native browser from the operating system. In Windows, that's Edge Chromium. In the Mac, that is the WebView that is based on the Safari browser. And it's the WebKit browser on the Linux operating system. So we use what is already available, and that enables us to create an executable, a single executable application without any other things that you need to carry around. Another thing is that Electron, the Electron API is actually the bridge between the web application and the operating system. And that's, of course, in the hands of the organization. I don't know who is behind Electron, etc. I have actually no idea. But what I have seen is that it evolves quickly. And let's say that they are not using the Delphi philosophy of staying backwards compatible.
Understatement. Yeah.
So that means that, yeah, if we wanted our, but we can also target the Webcore application to Electron, but to keep up with Electron was really a challenge, because every new Electron version, they change something here, break something there, always something. And now we have this fully under control ourselves. So we keep it stable. At least that is our goal, to keep it stable. And in addition, something like database access, for example, that is an Electron. To get that done in Electron is There is a JavaScript library for Node that you use for MySQL. There is a completely different library for SQL Server. There's another completely different library with a different paradigm and API and etc. etc. There is nothing in common. So that's the big difficulty, for example. And here we have this all under control ourselves. And so we can make the database access from a Miletus application abstract, and in your Miletus application you don't have to care whether you are working with a MySQL or a SQL Server or whatever. And on top of that is that this shell application, obviously, there is no mystery about it. It is built with Delphi itself. It's thanks to the power of Delphi that this is possible. And when we want to add or expose some access to the operating system that is not available in Electron, that someone has a particular need for whatever, something special, there is no way that you ask the Electron people, please give me that functionality. But here we have it under control. We can do it ourselves. And that's what I like about that approach.
The biggest criticism that's always leveled against Electron is the fact that it runs on Node.js. It is essentially a Node.js application. And Node.js, whilst being very popular with web developers and JavaScript people, it is absolutely notorious for massive bloat. You know, and it's one of the key things that is a sort of a highlight between a Delphi program and a Node or Electron-based program, is that a Delphi program initially may be a certain size, but it doesn't get any bigger. And when running at runtime, you know, it's very efficient. Whereas a Node application, you know, like for example, Spotify app, which is a Node, is based on Electron. It's huge. It's a huge memory hog, and I think that the thing that I saw with Miletus was that there was a possibility that that would not be the case, and more, you know, that you wouldn't get that kind of problem with that you do with Electron apps where it would bloat, because you're much smaller and more tightly focused. When you say that you use the native browser that's on the operating system, does that mean that you could use any browser that was on Windows, or the one that's the default browser, or one that's installed? Is there, let's say for Windows, I might have Edge and Chromium and Firefox. Can I choose which browser, or is it one that's built in?
It's the one that is nowadays baked in Windows 10 or 11, which is the Edge Chromium browser. So that's always the one that will be used. And an additional thing is that obviously we are not using Node.js as the server that runs inside. Here we are using Delphi, a Delphi-based HTTP server that runs inside the Miletus application. The browser itself, so the memory consumption of Electron applications is partly due, as you indicate, due to Node.js, but also partly due to the browser itself. And so here also we need to be open and transparent and clearly look at it from a technical perspective. A browser will add, that's our measurements at least on a Windows operating system. You need to take into account that, and actually the same thing will happen when you just drop a T web browser on your VCL application, the built-in Delphi 11 browser that also uses Edge Chromium. Take into account approximately 50 megabytes of memory goes into that browser instance. That's more or less what we see in our measurements.
Yeah, I think there's going to be an overhead. The funny thing was that one of the applications we wrote using Webcore actually had a custom written web server that sounds a bit like the Miletus thing, in the background that served up those pages. And if Miletus had been around, we probably would have used that instead. But we actually had an app that ran, it was just a pure Delphi app. It's got I think it was some kind of web, I can't remember exactly the details of the implementation. I think it was an indie HTTP server or something like that in the background. And what it did was just served up the application, which was a Webcore application. It was a single page app. It was designed to fulfill a specific purpose to do with job tracking. So people would log on and off jobs, like making a table or some furniture or something, and they would record those steps and the customer and all the rest of it. But Miletus would, and that was Windows only because I just happened to write the app for Windows only. But of course, if we'd used Miletus, then it would have worked on anything, which was interesting. The reason we did it that way was because we had some very specific data handling that needed to go backwards and forwards between the Webcore app and the back end, which then linked onto a thick client Delphi application and some stuff like that. So there was, we did literally need to access the operating system, and of course we couldn't do that from a pure browser app. So our little indie HTTP based TMS Webcore hybrid did what Miletus did and allowed the access that wasn't possible via the browser. So interesting. I mean, I think Miletus is a very interesting technology. I've only just briefly looked at it, but we've not seriously tried to use it yet. But I can see it's going to be on our list at some point. You know.
Actually, I want to add to that I explained that the Miletus architecture is a native application that hosts a browser, and there is a bridge that allows bidirectional communication between the native application and the browser. So the native application can call specific JavaScript routines from the web application, and the other way around. The JavaScript code can launch a call into the native application where it listens to events, and then it can react to these events. Actually, this is based on the Miletus architecture is based on the FNC browser, which is our FNC browser control that gives you a unified or universal browser experience for whatever type of application that you want. And with that FNC browser also comes that bridge. So that means that regardless of Miletus, if you just use that FNC browser and that FNC bridge, you can already build similar things yourself with these building blocks and do custom bridge communication, whatever you want. So that's where that actually is where it comes from, and I just want to tell it here so that users do not have the perception that this is a kind of closed box. No, FNC, the code is there and you can use it. And actually, just like we discussed with Jim about creative approaches, I will be happy, I will be curious, I will be very pleased to see other people come up with other new creative ideas to mix these things, to do hybrid things. Actually, all in the end, the goal is to achieve something for a customer. If a customer wants to do X or Y, I always think in terms of if we as Delphi developers can deliver a Delphi-based solution, I think then we have done a great job, and that's also in connection to the different kinds of tools that exist for Delphi. Like you mentioned IntraWeb, and like you mentioned UniGUI and other approaches, native approaches, FireMonkey based, etc., etc. There's so much, and I think that's also the richness of Delphi, that there is this large freedom of choice, and each chooses what is the best for his particular case, if only it serves the needs of some customers, users who then use it on a daily basis and do something productive with it.
Well, the streams that Holger and I have done in the past together on that have got the most views on the Embarcadero channel have been the ones where we've been talking about web technology. Funnily enough, with Delphi, something like 11,000, 12,000 views, and we always get quite a lot of, many thousands of views anyway on some of the things we talk about. Obviously, maybe they're all tuning in to see us fail. I don't know, but I don't think so. And the ones that seem to get the most hits are the ones where we're talking about how to do web kind of stuff, front end, or even entire web applications using Delphi. So I think based on that, there seems to be a big interest. That's your daughter, I'm guessing. So hi, hello from the British person and all these other people in the background. Hello. It's like, what's he doing? Hey, my dog appears as well. My dog is Employee of the Month, by the way. He's done very well this month. Yeah.
Ever since that one, was it the BBC live stream where the person was on the news and their kid came in on like and the wife's like crawling in, right? It's like, okay, we all know it. We're all have family. We're all at home.
I think that's the thing. The only one good thing to come out of the pandemic is that people have become more familiar with the concept of remote working and more the fact that live streams, this is not a TV production where people have to wear shirts and ties and good evening, this is the news from the BBC. It's not like that. This is more, we're all human beings. So maybe developers and CEOs and developer advocates, and I'm not quite sure what Holger is, but whatever Holger is as well. But we are, underneath it all, we are just normal people that just get on and code for a living and try and run our businesses. And we have dogs that bark at the neighbours sometimes, and we have kids that come in and say hi. And do you know what? It would be a worse place if we didn't acknowledge that, working from home has got lots of benefits and sometimes a few little downsides where, that poor guy was being interviewed by the BBC and his wife did this kind of, special forces crawling and dragged away the child. I felt a bit sorry for the little kid, really. My dogs are trained to sleep. They just go and he's down on the floor asleep again now. So it's usually pretty good.
One more thing about Miletus that fascinates me is the fact that you can compile for all the platforms without having the hardware. So you can create a Linux application without having a PA server running on Linux, or you can compile for the Mac OS without having a Mac. So that makes yes, and the same for the Raspberry Pi. You just compile out of the IDE. You don't need a PA server. You don't need a TMS PA server. You don't need anything like that. You just compile.
I didn't know that. That is interesting because that does mean that you could have one build box that targeted all the targets.
Correct.
That's
and you deploy it for all the different platforms.
So does it bundle like a stub that run the Miletus interface with like the payload that you compiled? Is that how it works then?
See, that was how I implemented that back end with the hybrid thing as well. Isn't that weird how, two different kind of, I mean, we had a different, I suppose it was a similar purpose, but we just came up with that idea. I looked around and nobody was doing it. And so at the time, it was about 2 years ago we did this. I think Webcore was quite new at that point. And we did it as a trial, and I said, hey, let's use Webcore because it was great. And to come up with similar technology. Now, we didn't obviously spot the idea of then having different targets. We just did the Windows one. We did look at possibly doing it with Linux and things like that as well. But our biggest reluctance with Linux was just that our tech support people are Windows people rather than Linux people, and the management got a little bit scared of the idea of supporting Linux, even though I started out as a Unix guy back in the day. But I saw the demo that you did. I think it was Holger's video of targeting the Raspberry Pi. Was it your video? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and Tim
I've seen some with Bruno in as well, so I kind of blurring into one thing after too much vodka and beer, But it was targeting the Raspberry Pi is a very good trick because there are a lot of people out there that see the Raspberry Pi for what it is, which is an absolute genius piece of equipment. back in the 80s, there used to be a thing called the BBC B, which was a computer that was released with the backing of the British Broadcasting Corporation, which is a government-funded TV channel. And it was made by Acorn Computers, and it was extremely popular in schools because it was quite cheap. And the backing of the BBC meant that they taught people to program. And many people learned to program in the UK either with the Sinclair Spectrum, because Clive Sinclair, you know, was releasing a very cheap computer at the time, or they used the BBC B. The Raspberry Pi is a kind of continuation of that idea because it's very, very cheap hardware, very easy to obtain, and just works. And there are many cases, and you know, the idea of putting the hats on, you know, you can have these things like a camera interface. You just plug it in and off you go. Or, oh, you want to drive some LEDs? Oh, you want to drive some relays? Oh, you want to have a fountain program by it? You know, that's the thing. There's examples out there. So I think the missing bit at the moment for Delphi is being able to target the Raspberry Pi easily. And I think Myelitis being able to do that really piqued my interest. I saw that video. I'm like, oh, that's interesting, because we could then have a little box with a Raspberry Pi in it, or even tell the customer to go and buy one. We can have our application. It downloads onto a Raspberry Pi, and there you go. You've got a system in a box. Now, you know, you need a fairly powerful one for some of the things we want to do, but you know, for the more simple stuff, it would allow them to have a thing that was plugged onto their network that provided the functionality. For us as a business, we're just selling the program. We don't have to worry about the hardware. Oh, your hardware breaks down, buy a new one. Just buy it off the shelf and off you go. Whereas with a PC or a server, that's actually a kind of higher barrier to entry. But we can encapsulate our program, and we can have a time and attendance system that would just exist in that Raspberry Pi. It means we don't have to go to places like China and Brazil and things like that to buy the time and attendance hardware that we buy at the moment. We could have concentrate solely on the software, and you can choose the hardware, and our stuff will run it. And that's a very good win for us, because the software is obviously 90% profit once you've recouped the development costs.
You know, the architecture like that years ago, 20 plus, actually Windows 98 would have been roughly the time period. I was working for a company that made PCs, Micron Computer, and we needed a solution. We wanted a solution for a CD we'd ship with the computers that have all the drivers and everything, all the documentation for it. And I built it with Delphi using, this was before the T-Web browser, but you could use the ActiveX thing to embed Internet Explorer. I embedded Internet Explorer on there, and then I could have another team develop all the content of what went in there. And then I had special hooks in place in the browser for the application I wrote, so it would recognize that when you were trying to reinstall a driver or run a setup program, whatever like that, and then the Delphi application could handle that in addition to the web browser content to do the driver installation or run tests or diagnostics or configuration or whatever the case may be. So yeah,
you know, I think that this is the missing link for a lot of Delphi programmers, is having that web interface, because I think up until recently the solutions that were available were either quite difficult to understand how to make them work, or they weren't mature enough, and the acceptance of having a browser interface was not quite as prevalent as it is now. Now that the browser market has stabilized a lot more, and the idea of having ubiquitous internet everywhere is something that, you know, 10 years ago, lots of companies didn't actually always have internet access. I know it's bizarre to think, but it's true. I know, based on our customer base of, you know, 12,000 people or 15,000, now almost everybody has got internet access in their offices, even if it's grossly restricted down to just a small allowed selection of sites you can go to. My wife's company only allows them to go to, you know, approved sites rather than ones they don't approve of, for obvious reasons, for network integrity as much as anything else. But now that that is more ubiquitous and people have internet access, then this question of how can I make my Delphi stuff work with a web interface is becoming more and more relevant. And it's also the fight that we have with people saying, well, Delphi, oh, you know, doesn't, I don't use Delphi anymore. Well, why not? You're an idiot, you know. it's
I have a question about Myelitis. You mentioned that you can respond and make extensions to it, potentially that Electron can't do. It's interesting. So I was curious about the differentiation between Electron, because one of the things about Electron is I think there's like an 8-week or more often cycle that you have to release updates to Electron applications because of the patching process for security vulnerabilities and such. So the fact that you're not doing that means that you have more stable as well. But the other thing, I know, so I was talking to someone else that built an application using Electron because they thought it would let them get to market quicker, but they discovered that Electron was great for like the high-level user interface stuff, but pretty soon they discovered they needed some lower-level things beyond what they could do with the JavaScript through Node.js. So they ended up having to write a bunch of C libraries, which then they had to write across all the platforms, and ended up taking them a lot longer, a lot more expensive. My question, though, is with Miletus, can I write code in Delphi that I can distribute as a library with Miletus application, or is there some way I can extend it with native code, or is that all the native part, all the compiled to binary part done by the TMS, and all I'm doing is writing the code that gets transpiled to JavaScript that runs inside the browser?
In this stage, it is something that we provide. So this native shell application, and we can, as such, we develop it, we can extend it. The plan is, at this moment, the source code of that shell application is not available, but we plan to go in a direction where there is also a way that you can fully build that application, that shell application yourself. Actually, I indicated that via FNC and FNC Bridge, you can already more or less do it yourself, but the goal on longer term is to enable you, as you indicate, if you have whatever library that for performance reasons is better to run native, that you can cook that, so to speak, into that shell application. That's the goal. That's not yet where we are, just because of the flow of integrating that into the Delphi IDE is, of course, a different process when you talk about this, Jim, as what we are doing now. So the flow would become more complex. And so that is still on our to-do list. That is still in the goal for the coming versions, to investigate how we can make that flow. And I think the critical part here is to make that flow robust, because if you do whatever with the shell application and the bridge breaks, the whole thing breaks. So it needs to be brought in a sufficiently robust way that I would call it that you can isolate it in your part and do your extensions, but on the other side, that the available bridging itself remains isolated and cannot break in 1, 2, 3 when you start adding code and the whole thing collapses. That's on the drawing board to still further work on.
We're running out of time, but the only other key thing I would say about Electron, the only thing I like about it actually, is that Electron apps can update themselves very easily. The update mechanism is actually minimal. And you can do that with one of your components. Actually, T-Web Update, I think, is one of your components. But I don't know if Miletus includes that capability, but it is one of the things that Electron does score on, that if you write an Electron app, it's almost trivial to have your app updated, that you push to a particular resource, and then Electron, when it starts, goes, oh, there's a new version, would you like to install it? And it installs it straight away. And that's kind of nice. I like that thing, but everything else about it I absolutely hate. You know, Electron is annoying. There's just so many things that just oh god, you know. If Miletus was able to do that, or make it as streamlined as was possible to make it streamlined, there's always going to be some machinations in the background that you're going to have to do. But if you did that, then you've got you've got some kind of winner on your hands there, because I think that a lot of people are not particularly satisfied with Electron, and I think that the Delphi people that will eventually see this stream will probably they're going to look at Webcore and look at Miletus and go, there's a solution that could really solve a lot of problems and make life a lot easier. And new programmers coming to it who want to embrace web technologies and produce web apps. Delphi is a good language. It's easy to understand, and if you can start writing Delphi programs and produce web apps, then why would you go and learn something awful like JavaScript or you know, something bizarre like Angular, or when you could do something in a language it's actually Pascal was designed for tuition. You know, it was designed for people to learn programming, and we've built on that with Object Pascal being, you know, that great learning resource with good functionality bolted on top, and then be able to extend that and produce web apps with that. I don't want people to say I'm a Delphi programmer moving to Webcore or web technologies. I want to say people to look at it and go, I want to produce a web app, or I want to produce a cross-platform app. I'll use Delphi. You know, it's a slightly different approach. Not Delphi people becoming web developers, but people wanting to have a web app and choosing Delphi as the language to back it up behind the scenes, because it's got so much going for it. You know, it's an easy language to get to grips with, far more so than C#, I think. I know also, that, and
also the fact that it is component-based development, which means everything you interface with is T-component based with properties, events, methods, all
original code.
Just standardized. While if you are in the web world, you are dealing with a library written by, let's say, group X and another library written by group Y, with totally different approaches, architectures, calling conventions, whatever. And so it's always a mind switch. And I think the big advantage of Delphi is that this consistency and this consistency along the way of in all these technical directions, in such a broad scope of things that you can do, from command line little things to cross-platform applications, mobile applications, but the approach to create it is always in that consistent way. The language is consistent, the approach is consistent, and that's what I like. And that's what I dislike in the web world, to be honest, that with each thing that you look at, it is created by a different group. Take, for example, React versus Angular. I'm not saying that either React is bad or Angular is bad. Both are great, but it's completely different paradigms. And okay, your mind has to switch from this paradigm to another paradigm, and it's just
ASP.NET, ASP.NET, exactly the same. You know, there's 55 different ways to have a web language, and that's the thing. And also, most web languages are declarative in that you are coding a user interface. With Delphi, you're drawing a user interface at the most basic level, and and also some of the functionality you're dropping components on and then setting the properties. It is low code, and that's the. I know we're kind of jumping on that bandwagon, but it really is. That's where it came from. You know, I'll keep saying that until people get the message and start stop doing it the hard way and start doing it the easier way. Use Delphi. Get on with it. You know.
And I think also, let's be honest, this is what gives us the productivity.
Correct. Yeah. I tell people I'm lazy. They don't believe me. You know.
So we do need to wrap up. Bruno, if somebody wants to get started with programming and building their interface in the browser, whether it be for Miletus or just building an application with TMS Webcore. Is there a trial on TMS's website, or what's the best way to get started with that?
I would recommend 3 things. First of all, there is a fully functional trial version you can download from our website. So you can install it up until the latest Delphi 11, and you can start developing web applications. I would recommend, in addition to that, to read up a little bit in particular about the approach to access databases, because as I explained, this is a different paradigm, and you will typically want to use a REST API. And to learn about that paradigm, I have 2 sources that I can recommend you. First of all, the books from Holger. Holger's books are all available from Amazon, so worldwide. And on the other side, there's also a training course from our colleague, Wagner. And this training course brings you through steps, learning everything about that new paradigm, how to use a REST API to work with your database in the backend, in the server. So that's my recommendation. If you are new to this world, get the trial, get the sources, the books, or both, the training session. And of course, know that our team, we are here, we get questions on a daily basis on various topics. So we always try to do our best to give you a helping hand in entering this new world if this is new for you.
TMS has also great forums, forums.tmssoftware.com. So that's also available to get in touch with other developers that use TMS Webcore. Also a great place. And of course, Delphi proxies
that we organize. So you can also actually, we have the TMS Web Academy that we launched on this year, February 15. And so this is a way to also give learning capabilities to our users, and all the webinars organized this way are available for replay. So also there's a lot of resources where you can find the content that we already produced, but we go on, we keep on giving webinars. If you have ideas, suggestions for topics for webinars, you're welcome. Send them and we'll be happy to provide them this way. So I think also this Web Academy is a great learning source for you.
Okay. All right, excellent. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being on, and thanks to all of our audience members for being out here with us as we have a nice little conversation, and we will see you all next time. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.